And I am making a video for you about air masses today. This is lesson 6 in the DINB. It starts on slide 21, and then most of the notes we'll be taking is on slide 22. So follow along with this lesson today in order to fill out slide 22. Okay, so let's chat about air masses. Air masses. What you are going to do first is you are going to watch this video, or you may have watched it already. I feel like that does cover a lot about air masses. It also starts to introduce fronts, which we'll learn about next time. Anyway, so after watching that video, let's kind of get some definitions here in our DINB, and let's answer this first question of what is an air mass? How we define an air mass is an air mass is a huge body of air that has similar temperature and humidity. So you're going to fill in that blank in your DINB with the word temperature and humidity. Okay, so in your DINB right here, you're going to write temperature and humidity. So with air masses, they basically are defined based off of what their temperature is and what their humidity or water content is. Now, another thing about air masses is they form where those conditions are like that all year long. So they are going to form in similar places, and there are places on the earth, which you'll see in just a moment, that have similar temperatures and humidities throughout the entire year. So that's generally what an air mass is. So let's talk a little bit more about the humidity and the temperature aspect. So how do we describe the air mass's humidity? We will describe it either by calling it maritime or continental. All right, so maritime or continental. I'm gonna try my laser pointer here. Maritime or continental. Maritime. Maritime, this is describing humid air masses. Maritime air masses form over water. In this case, in the United States, these form over the oceans. So we would describe a maritime air mass as a humid and wet air mass that forms over the ocean. Continental air masses are the opposite. They are dry. They form over land. So continental, think of the continents. Those are big landforms, basically. And continental air masses form over land, and they are dry. They don't have a lot of water on them, so or are able to be picked up really by that air mass. So the continental air masses are dry. So that's how we describe the humidity, either maritime or continental. The second part that we use to describe humidity is temperature. For temperature, we describe the temperatures by either calling it the air mass polar or tropical. Polar, as you probably know by this point, is polar means cold. These air masses form at higher latitudes. So basically, if the air mass is forming near the North Pole or near the South Pole, we would call that a polar air mass. On the other hand, tropical air masses, these are warm air masses. Their temperatures are generally warm. They form in lower latitudes or in latitudes near the equator. So equator is about here. These are air masses that form near the tropics area or near the equator. Now think about the other thing that to know is we do describe some air masses, depending on where we are in the world, as equatorial or Arctic. Equatorial air masses are like super warm, way warmer than tropical, and they're also really wet. Arctic air masses are similar to polar air masses, but these are way colder and way drier. Now, you don't really need to know equatorial and Arctic because we don't experience those in the United States, and we're just going to look at the 6 air masses in the United States. But just know that these are 2 other types of air masses that we can get. Okay, so let's combine these. So we're going to talk about how do we combine the humidity and temperature in order to describe or name the air mass. So maritime, continental, polar, tropical, how do these work out? So this is right out of your notes, and you are going to fill this in. So the first type of air mass we are going to talk about is maritime tropical. So maritime tropical air masses, the symbol that we use for this is MT. Now, I don't know why one is lowercase and one is uppercase. I guess the humidity is always lowercase and the temperature is always uppercase, but I don't really know who decided that. Anyway, so maritime tropical, the symbol we use for that is MT. As we know, maritime air masses form over the ocean. And that T here represents tropical, so we know the temperature is warm. And the humidity, because it is forming over the ocean, we are going to have a wet air mass. All right, so that's what you're putting for the first one. Up next, we're going to talk about maritime polar. The symbol that we use for maritime polar is MP. Again, lowercase m, uppercase P. Now, maritime, as we saw with maritime tropical, with maritime polar, it also forms over the ocean. So if it's maritime, it is forming over the ocean. The temperature for this one, because it is polar and forming in the polar regions, it is a cold temperature air mass. And the humidity, because it's forming over the ocean, it is a wet humidity. Okay, up next is continental tropical. Continental tropical, the symbol for this is CT. Lowercase c, uppercase T. Where continental tropical forms is over land. We have a little bit of a change here. Remember, continental means, or continent, right? That means land. So continental tropical will form over the land. The temperature for this one, because it is tropical, it means that it is warm. Okay, so warm temperature, tropical means warm. And then finally, because it's forming over land, the humidity is dry. We have a dry humidity for this one. Because it's forming over land, it is dry. All right, that's continental tropical. Our last one we're going to talk about is continental polar. Continental polar, the symbol is CP. And because it's continental, it forms over land. The temperature for continental polar is, whoa, why did I say warm? I meant to say cold. I need to edit that. My bad. Good thing I caught that mistake. All right. The temperature for continental polar is cold, not warm. What was I thinking there? All right, so continental polar is cold. And the humidity for this one is dry. Because the air mass is forming over land, we don't really get a lot of water, so that humidity is dry. Okay, up next, we are going to try to place these air masses on a map of the United States. Before we do that, look here. We have all of these. Now that you kind of know what the symbols mean, we can sort of see these air masses across the globe. Here we have a maritime tropical, continental polar, continental tropical, continental polar, maritime polar. Super exciting. You will notice here, though, remember how I talked about those Arctic air masses and that equatorial air masses? We're not going to worry about those, but that's where we'd find a couple of them. All right, so let's look here at the United States. You might want to pause and maybe think about this, see if you can fill it in yourself. We have 6 air masses in the United States, in the lower 48 states, I should say. In Alaska and in Hawaii, we have a different air mass, but we're just going to focus on the continental United States, meaning the lower 48 states. So in your DINB, you have a very similar map here, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 air masses. And try to think about, you might want to pause here and after I'm done explaining, but think about, where is the air mass forming? Is it on land, or is it in the ocean? And then is it coming from the poles up here, or is it coming more from the tropics and the equator down here? And that will give you the name of each of these air masses. So pause the video, try to fill that out in your DINB, and then I'll give you the answers in just a moment. All right, so hopefully you paused and did a little bit of thinking. Let's go ahead and identify these 6 air masses. So, air mass number 1. Air mass number 1 is maritime polar. I already kind of gave that in the example. It's forming over the ocean. It's forming over the ocean, and it's in a more northern, higher latitude region, so it is going to be polar and cool. I want to make sure real quick, actually, that this is the same as your DINB. Yep, it's the same, okay? Then let's talk about number 2. Number 2. For number 2, this, look here, it is forming over land. So, number 2, it will be continental polar. Continental polar. Because it's forming over land, it's going to be dry. And because it's polar, it's going to be cool. Next up, number 3. Number 3 is a very similar situation as number 1. We have maritime polar here as well. That will be wet because it's forming over the ocean, and it will be cool because it is in a colder latitude region, higher latitudes. All right, let's move on through 4, 5, and 6. 4 and 6, this one and this one, these are maritime tropical. Look where they are forming. They are forming in the ocean, so that's maritime. And they are lower latitudes. They're in areas that are hot. So we would call that tropical for the temperature. Maritime tropical for 4 and for number 6. And then for number 5, our last one that we're going to talk about is continental tropical. Now, yes, this one is a little bit closer to the ocean than number 2 up here. However, the majority of its time is going to be spent on land, and it's starting on land. So this one is continental tropical. Continental for forming on land, and tropical meaning that it's in a lower latitude. So its humidity and temperature will be dry and warm. Dry and warm. Okay, so make sure that you have that in your DINB. I'm going to show you one last thing. I know that I didn't have you do the humidity and temperature, but you're welcome to do that. Make sure that you're also labeling these here, okay? That will help you later on. Okay, so one last thing I want to chat about is how do these air masses interact? So these air masses interact to create fronts and weather. If you think about and remember high and low pressure, you can probably assume and remember that high pressure areas usually form where there is cold temperatures. So our high pressure air masses will be up usually in the northern United States. So maritime polar, continental polar here, and maritime polar. These are high pressure areas. Whereas low pressure happens in warmer areas. So we will see a little bit more lower pressure with the maritime tropical, maritime continental, and maritime tropical over here. So how does this create fronts and weather? So if we look here at the high pressure is going to, these air masses are going to push out clockwise from the center of the air mass. So it's going to kind of push this way. And then down here in the southern United States, the low pressure pulls air masses together and in a counterclockwise formation. So basically these air masses in the north are kind of attracted or end up interacting with these air masses down here. Now, these are general weather fronts, and if you ever pay attention to the news, you will see, you might recognize some of these symbols. If you ever watch the Weather Channel or watch the weather on your nightly news or look at radar, but these symbols are indicating different sorts of fronts. So we can get warm fronts, we can get cold fronts, we can get stationary and occluded fronts, which we will talk about those next time in more detail. But just know that these air masses generally, because of their pressure, either high or low, we're going to see them come together, be pushed towards each other, or be pulled because remember, air moves from high to low. All right, so that is it for today. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please reach out to me, Ms. Schlender, and make sure that you do the VNQ quiz after this and make sure that you're taking good notes in your DINB. All right, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your day.